So I think we have a critical mass now. I'm Barbara Ransby. I want to welcome you all to this important book event and conversation hosted by the Portal Project of the Social Justice Initiative, which is housed at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I want to start by thanking our staff at SJI, Bettina Johnson, who you just met if you were on, but also Essence McDowell, Lillian Peniagua, and Mia Silva, who has joined us to help out with today's event. What is the Portal Project? The Portal Project is a 2-year-long movement-centered think tank involving artists, activists, and scholars from around the country and around the world. We have hosted literally hundreds of hours of discussion in workshops and working groups, exploring the big question, what does a just transition look like? How do we understand some of the key social justice campaigns of the 21st century as accelerating the process of social transformation? And how are those movements connected to one another? The 3 campaigns that we've looked at are economic democracy campaigns, abolition campaigns, and the climate justice movement. We have 12 community activists who are serving as Margaret Burroughs Fellows, and we have 5 Marielle Franco Fellows collaborating with us. We are thrilled to have the incomparable Angela Davis as one of our inaugural Marielle Franco Fellows, and she is part of the conversation today. It is such an honor to be hosting this conversation on International Women's Day with some of the most eloquent and persistent voices against all forms of state violence, and to focus on this book, Abolition.Feminism.Now, published by Haymarket Books and co-authored by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie, otherwise known as the Fab Four. This book is an abolitionist feminist genealogy. It is a provocation, it is a demand, and it is a call for action. We come together at a time with this book as our catalyst when state violence is doing so much harm, from carceral institutions in the United States to the war machine that is raining bombs down on the civilian population of the Ukraine. The domestic and transnational wars, military and economic, continue to wreak havoc upon the lives of people from Tigray to Haiti to the Congo. So we look to a serious conversation today, but we also draw hope and inspiration and joy from the movements that these speakers have been a part of and continue to build. So I will kick us off by introducing our moderators who will facilitate the conversation and will give more formal introductions of our speakers. The first person I want to introduce is my dear colleague and collaborator in many things, Dr. Stacy Sutton. She's an associate professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy here at UIC and the director of the Applied Research and Strategic Partnerships at the Social Justice Initiative. Her scholarship and teaching are in community and economic development, and her research looks at collective action and equitable development in marginalized communities. She is also on the board, the editorial board of In These Times magazine, and continues to work in a number of community-based racial justice organizations and coalitions, including Chicago's R3 Coalition. The second moderator today is Hashim Benford. Hashim is currently a strategist for the Grassroots Policy Project. He grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and developed a conscious awareness of structural racism at an early age. His passion for transformative change is fueled by a lifetime of experiencing and witnessing the violence of oppression and exploitation, as well as by his deep faith in the capacity of human joy and resilience. He has been an activist for over 15 years. He's older than he looks, including work at the Miami Workers Center and Power Youth for Social Change. He also has worked with the Funders Collaborative on youth organizing. This past year, Hashim has served as a facilitator for the working groups of the Portal Project and held together a set of circuitous dialogues that would have caused a less capable and savvy facilitator to age quickly or quit, and we're glad he did not do either. So with those 2 moderators in charge, I'm going to turn the program over to them and look forward to a stimulating and provocative conversation.
Thank you, Barbara. So just in terms of how we will kind of proceed, I'm going to just offer the bios of our guests, and then they will come on screen. And then we'll start a set of questions and dialogues and with them with regard to the book, but also with regard to the broader Portal Project, or at least as the Portal Project intersects with many of the themes in the book with regard to abolition and feminism. So I'll start in the order of authorship, and first being Angela Davis. I think we know who she is. But she is a professor or a professor emerita of history of consciousness and feminist studies at UC Santa Cruz. She's an activist, a writer, a lecturer, and her work on prisons, police abolition, and the related intersections of race, gender, and class. She's the author of many books, including the book we're going to engage, but she more recently, or I guess at the same time, I think they came out at the same time, is the book Angela Davis, an autobiography, which was newly released. And there's also To Freedom is a Constant Struggle. Gina Dent, Associate Professor of Feminist Studies, History of Consciousness, and Legal Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is currently a faculty fellow at in Santa Cruz in the Institute of the Arts and Sciences, and she's working on an exhibition called Barring Freedom. And she's also the co-convener of the Visualizing Abolition series of events. Next up would be Erica Miner, and she is a professor of education and women's education and women's gender and sexuality studies at Northeastern Illinois University. I've heard she's a fierce organizer in Chicago, but also a writer and an educator. She's the author of From the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, and she co-authored The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence. And she's also the co-editor of The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Towards Freedom. And finally is Beth Ritchie. She's the head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and a professor of Black Studies at UIC here, the University of Illinois, Chicago. And the focus of her scholarly work and activism has been on the ways in which race and ethnicity and the social position of this doesn't seem to read well, but the ways that race, ethnicity, and the social position affect women's experience of violence and incarceration, focusing on the experiences of African-American women, battered and sexually assaulted survivors. And she's the author of Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation, among other things. So I guess we'll get started by asking a set of questions. And I will kick off the questions. So the first question that we'd really like to kind of hear from, especially I'll turn to Beth as the first person to answer this, is, just perhaps help us understand why this book, why Abolition.Feminism.Now? Why did it feel important to offer this as an intervention now? And I guess to just kind of add to that, how did you see what's happening within our movements as a way of suggesting that this is the time in which we should be engaging this approach?
Good, thank you, Stacy. Thanks to the Portal Project. I'm delighted to be here. Happy International Women's Day. Thanks for asking that question. It's a good place to start, right? So the four of us have been thinking about, talking about, feeling about this book for a while. each of us kind of travel in different spaces, and looking at who's in the room, some spaces with some people who are here, travel in places where discussion about feminism didn't include attention to abolition. And then we're in abolition sessions, abolition as a demand, as an ideology, as a strategy, that were absent the discussion of feminism. We were often in those same spaces, in conferences, strategy meetings, classrooms, dinner parties, places where we'd be talking about with other feminists about what our next steps were, what our agenda was, what the urgent issues of our times were, and people were not talking about abolition. Or we'd be talking about abolition demands, and I should say including among people who were feminists or identified as feminists, or queer folks, non-binary people talking about abolition demands that didn't include attention to feminism. And we had those discussions often in the corners of those spaces, after the panel or before the strategy session, or as an aside at a dinner discussion. And we thought it was time for us to bring together what we've learned from so many people who are here and those who aren't, about how abolition work has to be driven by feminism, and feminist work, feminist challenges, feminist writing, feminist organizing has to include, maybe even start with, questions of abolition. And for me in particular, Stacy, the community of activists and scholars and survivors of gender violence that I travel with, there's huge concern now, I think almost more urgent concern than we have ever had, about what it means to try to do anti-violence work that doesn't include attention to abolition feminism. And the urgency comes from the rise in carceral feminism, where responses to gender violence focus on arrest or prosecution or surveillance or incarceration. And we know that those things are dangerous to the people who are most vulnerable to gender-based violence, but yet people are still calling for those responses. And we know that the questions of freedom for people who are incarcerated, in the movements that I travel in, the calls for freedom and decarceration and moratoriums on building carceral institutions, if they don't include attention to how gender plays into that work, that process of criminalization, the work will be insufficient. So for me, carceral feminism and abolition praxis that ignores gender are urgent issues. They're more urgent than ever. And abolition feminism for me provides an answer, not just a kind of rhetorical answer, but a strategic answer to how to really bring about the kind of change that will mean freedom from criminalization and the tyranny of that, and freedom from gender violence and the death that results.
Thank you, Beth. Just wondering, does anyone want to add? That was an excellent response.
I could.
Tina. Okay, good, please.
There's so many things we talked about the book, and I want to thank all of you for having us on. It's wonderful to be in front of this audience in particular, people who are scholar activists who are engaged with all of these issues. Gives us some time to think about things carefully. And I really appreciate how Beth opened. And one of the things we also talked about was, the work that I'm thinking of, work of people on this call and work of Barbara Ransby, of restoring to history some of the people who've been lost and the figures that have been lost. And the consequences of having constantly to reinsert Black feminists in particular, but also many others, into the histories of movements. And it's not just a question of a scholarly problem. It's a problem also for people in the movement, for people who are students, who are engaged with these issues, for people who are trying to look at the past as instructive for the present and the future. And so we wanted to be daring in a way and try to write something about this contemporary moment and to allow that moment to extend backward, at least to Attica, and to try and intervene in some way, not by saying we could be comprehensive about everything, because clearly we did not experience everything, we did not see everything, but to try to go from those experiences that we have had, those movements we know about, not only in the United States, but the ones we're engaged in around the world, and to use that as a way to hopefully avoid the problem of having to learn again and again and again, and the irremediable problem of trying to reinsert certain kinds of collective projects into history once that history has been written and understood.
Great. Anyone else? Angela, please.
Let me also thank you so much, Barbara and Stacy and Hashim, for moderating. And Beth has given the perfect answer, but I want to also try to bring us back to when we were initially discussing the possibility of writing a book, which was before the pandemic, before the surge in activism. It's interesting, we wrote this book on Zoom, and we started our Zoom meetings prior to the pandemic, not knowing that we were sort of in the vanguard of what everybody would be doing. But also the ideas that we had about the nature of the project did not necessarily include accounting for a surge in activism, a surge in abolitionist activism, especially. And also during the same period, and this precedes, of course, the pandemic, but the rise of Me Too and a surge in that kind of feminist activism that did not necessarily, I think, I just looked at my image. I think, can you see me freezing? Okay, I'm going to just turn it off and turn it back on again. I think it's at about midday. The internet is so crowded that I often have these problems. But I wanted to point out that we were recognizing that as a collective awareness of the structural character of racism began to define this current period of activism, we did not necessarily see the same kind of insight with respect to gender violence. There continued to be a focus on individuals with the assumption that what you do is punish the individual, carceral feminism, and that somehow or another you do what is possible to challenge gender violence. So we recognize these two approaches and recognize that the carceral feminism that was characterizing the way gender violence was being addressed really needed to be challenged. And how better to do that than within the context of a discussion of what we have come to call abolition feminism, that dates back to, as Beth pointed out, the previous period of abolitionist activism. So I think that as the months went by, we also recognized that there would be a period following this phenomenal activism, and that there would be a kind of counter-revolutionary period, because this is the way our victories in social justice struggles usually unfold. a tendency to move back from more radical demands and strategies that characterize the period of the surge. And so we thought that this might be a way to address that and to encourage people not to assume that just because the demonstrations have ended, that the struggle is over.
Stacey, I'd like to chime in with a follow-up question for anybody who wants to take it. I appreciate the kind of naming of how the intervention around abolition as a counter to carceral feminism and the ways that we think about addressing gender violence. I think another thing that comes through in the book that I'd like y'all to speak to is about how that kind of linking feminism to abolition is important, not just in the way that we're thinking about approaches and responses to gender violence, but in the way that we understand the carceral state itself, regardless of who the target is. So could you say a little bit more about like that linkage? You know, so for someone like, regardless of what kind of population of people who are criminalized you're talking about, I think the book is making an argument that a feminist analysis is imperative if we're thinking about solutions that move us away from putting people in cages and, you know, surveilling them and all of that.
I can jump in. I might also want to tag on to the back question, but I'll start just also by thanking Barbara and the Portal Project and Bettina and all the labor that made this event possible. So deep gratitude for that. And Hashim, I think that question is sort of central to the project. We were incorporating a sort of a feminist framework to remind us that, of course, prisons are central, but thinking about the long genealogy of feminist work that has pushed back against carcerality, the prison industrial complex, but pointing to the welfare system, pointing to the myriad of kinds of ways that women, and I'm using that term expansively, are punished by the prison industrial complex. And I think centering that organizing and centering that that framework, I think, was central to our work. I just want to jump back to the other question around time, just kind of briefly, because as Angela was talking, I was just thinking about this moment and the different meanings of the word now in our title. And, you know, throughout this project, we talked about temporality, and we were engaging, sort of really struggling with both, you know, how to line up a genealogy that doesn't always line up, how to think about time. And this, you know, as folks were responding to the last question, I was just thinking about the value of this project and this intervention in the now, in the moment of backlash, right? Of pushing back against demands to defund, and I was, giving a new meaning to that term, and also thinking about abolition feminism then as sort of this method for the long haul, and trying to think about it as a methodology as well. But coming back to your question, yes, I mean, trying to center work around mutual aid work around challenging sort of punitive practices of welfare and the foster care system. This was really central. We want to be paying attention to the prison, but also not necessarily just centering the prison in the work to challenge the prison industrial complex.
Yeah. It seems to me that what, gender violence is maybe the specific of the more general, sort of pattern around patriarchy, heteropatriarchy in particular, and white supremacy, and the prison embodies that. And so the work around abolition is beyond, of course, the prison or the carceral institution, but more the structural questions around domination, much of which is linked to white supremacy and heteropatriarchy. And so abolition and feminism kind of link up in the opportunity that feminist and abolition feminism creates, not only to deal with the very specific violences that people experience, but also the larger structures of domination that enable that violence. And we are really talking about both. We're really trying to talk about both. That's informed, I think all four of our work has informed by a both and certainly we hope that comes across in this project.
And also, I think that we need to be clear about our way of conceptualizing feminism. That it's not simply about questions of gender, although questions of gender are extremely important. It is methodologically about making connections and addressing interrelationalities, which are important in connection with the abolition of the prison industrial complex. As a matter of fact, the move from simply the notion of the prison to the prison industrial complex is a feminist move, taking into consideration all of the connections and the interrelations, the connection with capitalism, with racial capitalism. And so I think it is important that we think of the need to always bring abolition and feminism together as a way of assuring that we address the larger picture, as a way of assuming that we're not myopic in our efforts, that we don't think that the problems of imprisonment can be solved, that the abolition of that institution can happen without addressing, what Erica was referring to, the welfare system, without addressing the child protective services, without addressing border police. So we see that as the real I guess, heart of the feminism that we are suggesting be linked to abolition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I really appreciate that more expansive understanding, at least for me, of feminism and the feminisms that you've been describing. And that, I think the responses to that question lead me to ask a follow-up question, which is really and you started to address this, but it's how this framework, how abolition feminism, how you see it connected to the work around and resistance to the struggle around racial capitalism. And you started to get at that, Angela, I think, but I guess the follow-up to that follow-up would be thinking about state institutions, right? And so you mentioned the welfare state and other institutions. And when you overlay abolition feminism, I'm trying to understand what are we asking or demanding of these state institutions that are also violent? Are we talking about abolishing all of them, or how does that kind of align with the broader kind of framework that you offer? And I guess anyone, I don't know if Gina, please.
I don't know. We're all looking at each other. Well, so I think I like being on this call because I know the people on this call really understand this, that abolition doesn't just mean destruction. And so, transitioning from the discussion of feminism we were just having into thinking about this along with racial capitalism is really important, because it is also that feminism, which is really always about care and about building and about relationships and about thinking about how we sustain things. And so we are all aware, and hopefully people watching are aware, that what we are really talking about is how to move resources from the things that we think are destructive and killing people, and even and especially those that are proffered as protections, and then reinvesting in other spaces and other kinds of relationships. Now, that is being done within the historical time of racial capitalism. All of us are complicit in that space. And so we are thinking of abolition feminism as a way of being in a time of racial capitalism with a responsibility to the future. And at the same time, in this both and approach, with care for those who are suffering now, and frankly, care for the ways that we can all be better with each other. So this does mean that every institution, and I think about this quite a lot these days because we work in universities, and the university is a target of so much of this. So I think it can be an excellent example to try to think through this. You know, how do we think about what has happened in terms of the curriculum and in terms of the way in which we've tried to introduce subjects like racial capitalism, fields like ethnic studies, and other kinds of questions? What are the things that have become difficult still even to do in the university? And I think about internationalism. I think about work on the global South and the division between those who are often working at those questions and with those movements, and those who are working inside the US, and sometimes even in abolition. And so a lot of what we were trying to do was find a way to embrace all of the connections, to not lose sight of that connected tissue. And one way to do that is also to think about how we are all entwined, how we are all in relation to each other. In this moment, when people are really using phrases like abolish university, or to think about really defunding also the university, I think of it as really a time to imagine the difference between privatizing the university and defunding the aspects of the university that could benefit lives, and instead thinking about what it means to put resources back into the public. So I think all of us actually teach at public universities, and that responsibility is really important. I'm thinking of Chris Newfield's really important blog, Remaking the University, which constantly has been tracking the problem of the defunding of the university. And it's now become a target also by those who feel that we as faculty and others have not been serving the new students who are coming in, that the criteria are impossible, that the daily work is impossible, even that they look at us as if we're doing the work of the impossible. But then we're also looking at the fact that people who are incarcerated are asking again and again to have access to education. And we're looking at the development of programs for people who are currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated that I feel we need to be investing in. But what is the nature of those programs? What is the kind of education we want to deliver? How should it be delivered? And I think we're in a moment when we're asking a lot of those questions. What's the function of advanced education? I'm involved in a project at the University of California now, which has to do with getting advanced degree program access for people who are currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. And these have become really tough questions because it's assumed that there is nothing useful for our futures about these institutions. But I think that we actually do need to be investing in them and calling them to account for our futures.
Yes, Angela. Oh, you're muted.
I unmuted myself and then muted myself again. Sorry. Well, yeah. Thanks so much, Gina. This question is so important, and I think that it is actually essential to kind of challenge the modes of representation that place abolition so far to the left that it's only about getting rid of things. And as Gina pointed out, we really appreciate the audience today, the people who are on the call, who have a more nuanced understanding of abolition. But I think what I want to emphasize is the flexibility fact that radical analyses and radical strategies do not always compel us to distance and separate ourselves from those who are not calling for abolition right now. And I think we want to call for the kinds of intellectual engagements that help us to be aware of the implications of our words and our actions. I want to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about the way reform has so distorted our capacity to call for radical change. Because reform is always a solution to our problems, right? From housing and healthcare to police violence. But then when we point out that reform has been at the very heart of the history of these institutions, the prison and the police, from the very outset, and that reform is actually the glue that holds these organizations together. Now, we would make an entirely different kind of argument with respect to the university, and I really appreciate Gina's intervention on that. And we see that presumably progressive reforms in both institutions have ultimately led to greater repression and greater permanency. So these are two instances, and of course as we've been pointing out, we try to keep within the frame also institutions like Child Protective Services, which Dorothy Roberts calls the family police, the border police, and so forth. Now, the question is whether we would be able to extract the racism and the heteropatriarchy from the structure of these institutions without the entire institution collapsing. I would make the argument that if it were possible to get rid of the racism and the heteropatriarchy, nothing would be left of these institutions. And that's not necessarily the case with every single institution. So I think that we have to be clear about urging the kind of analysis, and this is the intellectual dimension of our movements, and we're not talking about an analysis that's only available to people who teach at the university or who are students. We're talking about a kind of popular analysis that can help us to recognize the link between our struggles against racial capitalism and our efforts to get rid of prisons and to get rid of the police. And knowing, I guess we also have to emphasize, although this has been rehearsed many times, that as Ruthie Gilmore says, it's not about absence, it's about presence. It's not just about getting rid of an institution because we think it's bad. It's about clearing the space, as she points out, so that we can imagine new ways of addressing these issues. And in a sense, the abolitionist campaign with respect to jails and prisons and so forth and so on, it's a kind of microcosm of how we need to think about getting rid of capitalism as well.
If I can add, I really appreciate where you ended, Angela, and Gina, where you started, because I think, part of what we are trying to argue alongside of is all of the people who are doing incredible writing, publishing, workbooks, zines, videos, right, about abolition, that we see ourselves as part of a community of people who are trying to advance in a really concrete way what abolition can look like. And on the one hand, what that offers from our perspective of abolition feminism is lots of chances to try lots of things that are about the kind of freedom that abolition feminism promises. And with trying lots of things, that means making lots of mistakes and trying again and talking to other people to redo. And so we're not saying abolition feminism looks like this, and any institution that doesn't look like this needs to be abolished. I mean, we're saying that subtly, but more overtly, I think what we're saying is that our institutions are flooded with, as Angela said, with racism, with heteropatriarchy. They're controlling, dominating carceral spaces, and whether that's a mental health clinic, a public school, child welfare, that our institutions don't do anything else in many instances except feed the carceral state, even though they may not be identified as carceral institutions. So abolition feminism is the opportunity to kind of get in there and try to do it differently. And sometimes it's a little tiny school on a corner that says we are changing our policy around punishment. And sometimes it's a mental health clinic that says really what people need are resources, not counseling that controls them, and then we turn them over if they don't show up for their appointment. You know, I mean, it's really trying to decarceralize, I'm not sure that's a word, but take the carcerality out of the institutions that for a long time are what people depended on. And included in that, to me, is trying to figure out those places where abolition has been part of how people are solving their problems all the time. There are kind of everyday abolition practices and small little programs and projects and initiatives. We call them mutual aid now, but we called them something else before, right? Where people are getting together and taking care of stuff. And how do we lift that up? How do we understand what it is? How do we not scale it up so it becomes part of the carceral state, but in fact, reward it and build it from where it is? And so in some ways, I worry a little bit about the everyone is an abolitionist and abolition is the answer to everything. I think it has to be more thoughtful, more studied, more debated, and it also has to be more nuanced and more forgiving and more generative of what I think is more everyday struggle. And feminists are good at that.
Thank you.
For that. Thank you. Thanks. So I'm gonna move us. The last thing that you just named, Beth, about kind of gets to one of the kind of the third opening question that we wanted to ask. And then after this, we're gonna move to the Q&A. So if folks out there have been sitting on questions or want to throw something out for the panelists, now's the time. And so this third question is about the questions about scale and thinking about strategy. I was saying to Stacy, as we were prepping, I think one of the most provocative lines in the book for me says that abolition feminist practices and analyses did not grow by scaling up or through institutionalizing forms of power. Predicated on sameness and often eradicating difference, scaling up can foreclose transformation. And I say that was provocative because as an organizer and someone who's constantly thinking about how do we build the kind of power and scale necessary to actually transform structures, I was really agitated in a generative way by that sentence. And also, I think what kind of comes through in the now section of the book is you all are very intentional about naming. You have the book focuses on small projects that we may have never heard of in really local situations, doing things like mutual aid and kind of deep visionary political education. And a lot of the work that I myself have been involved in is about uplifting transformative demands that are not quite, quote, winnable right now. And so I'm curious, maybe Erica, if you want to kick this off, about how do you all see, you also talk about the importance of a both and understanding of how we think about these things, and that we can find difference in unity and tensions can be generative. So thinking about this relationship between the kind of critical prefigurative nature of abolition feminism as an approach, and the question of if what we're talking about is something that's deeply embedded in the structures of racial capitalism itself, how do we build a power to build that world that we know is so sorely needed?
That's a great question. And of course, I really would like to hear your engagement much longer as a response to that. But maybe I do want to lean into the both and framework here, because I think that was really important to us as we were thinking and working through this project. And I'll offer kind of a concrete example from our work here in Chicago to sort of illustrate that question, that tension between, how do we do the slow, hard, long work of changing languages, of shifting horizons, of building different systems of relationality, some of that intimate work that Beth was just talking about in the last response, and at the same time, build new systems and structures, right? I'm thinking of the defund work here in Chicago, and we've elected these wonderful, a small handful of wonderful alder people, in Chicago. I'm thinking of Rosana Rodriguez, who's really committed to sort of thinking about treatment and care and affirming services and not policing. But, she got elected with a very narrow margin, and how we're going to get her reelected is if we do that sort of like slow community work so that people are, on board. And I think it's radical, small grassroots organizations that have done that have done political education work, that have introduced new language, that have, FOIA'd the budget and tried to, point to how we've defunded, mental health services and that care work that Beth was just talking about, and sort of channeled policing into that. And I think that is sort of slow work, that's sort of imaginative work, that's hearts and minds work. And of course I want to keep Rosana elected, but I think part of the work of keeping Rosana elected so she can make that demand, at the city level, and reduce the 40% of the city's operating budget that we spend on police in Chicago, is if the community is with her, if the community is thinking and feeling and negotiating safety in a different way. So I just want to offer that, and as sort of that both and tension is that we need Rosana to run. I hope she's not listening to this, and but we need people to run, but we sort of the both and we also need the as important work, maybe more important work of that slow political education, that community building, that new languages, new framework. And I think that often we just focus on the sort of, we need to get our people elected, and that's gonna, or we need to sort of get this, this budget line moved. And of course we need that. That's necessary, but I would argue never sufficient. But at the same time, those can be really thin victories, right? Thin wins, because that person's not going to get reelected, or that if the ideologically, if the white supremacist capitalist heteropatriarchy is still in place, then it doesn't matter, where we move the money, it's still going to be weaponized, against our communities. So I'm really, I appreciated you sort of flagging the both and. I think that that's how we're thinking about this work.
Does anyone else want to take that on? Angela or Beth?
Well, I think, the only thing I would say is I think that building is different than winning. And I think a lot of organizing, importantly, focuses on winning campaigns and then winning campaigns, which is always good if it's the right one. And I don't mean like electoral campaigns, yes, but I'm talking about like closing prisons, getting people released, getting Pell Grants back. There's very concrete campaigns that populate the landscape of abolition work. And those campaigns are important, and the winning is important, but building happens even in the losses, because that's when we are connecting with each other, reflecting on the strategy, engaging more people in the politic. It's the kind of community education that popular education that Erica was talking about. And so kind of shifting from the campaigns that we are losing and will continue to lose to building a movement that sustains over time past the campaigns, I think is really critical. And I think it's hard. I think it's hard now when people feel such urgency and such despair to figure out a sustained engagement with, and we've lived in this isolation for so long. Who's building anything except, their own little space to be better equipped to do a Zoom meeting? And I think we have to really start to figure out how we're going to get back out there and build campaigns again that are like in relationship, building power, collective power in relationship, not just win.
Before we go to the next, I just want to echo what you just said, Beth, because I think the book does a brilliant job of both excavating and documenting the many of the projects, the campaigns, the organizations that have been invisibilized for so long, and making those visible and keeping them within the bounds of a manageable book. I was deeply impressed, as well as excavating and making visible the ephemera, right? The visual, both the visual texts and the visual narratives that accompany many of the movement work, right? So the book is full of visuals that are extremely powerful, and they probably took a moment to find in the archives. But I think it really brings the work together. So I actually want to thank you for doing that. And I think in that, I might turn to Gina to help us understand the visuality of that. Like what might you offer there?
Yeah, thanks. I was actually already thinking about responding about visuality with the question that Hashim had asked about power. So maybe I'll connect them, because it's one of the reasons I've been so interested for so long in the questions of visuality and carcerality, because I've been thinking for a long time about how much we are bombarded with images that secure the futurity of the prison, and how much we can't avoid them. And from teaching, I feel like I learned this again and again, how my students in general, and it's a little bit different now when a lot of them think of themselves as abolitionists, but not as different as I would like, because there's a capacity to sustain an idea, a dependence visually on incarceration at the same time as a desire to be an abolitionist. And it sounds contradictory, but I think these are some of the most profound contradictions that we're living with. So for us, we were engaged in thinking about how to recognize, to recall, when you kindly referred to the archives, it might have been our messy closets we were finding things in. But it, trying to figure out how to include, really, and to think about all the things that we look at. I think, Beth, I should turn to you, because I remember you one time telling us that you had tacked on your bulletin board in front of you so many of the different images to be inspired by every day, which then inspired the rest of us, I think. But those images that are mostly constructed for movement work, that can be referred to as ephemera, are artistic, but they're also of a different kind. And so I'm interested both in what we were able to preserve and think about, but also in thinking about all the mass-produced images that counter that. And so for us, in a book that we hoped would circulate widely and was written for broad audiences, we wanted to just make it possible for people to see some of what we see and what we're surrounded by in our daily lives, and that many, many people don't see or think about as something that's just generated for a particular event, but don't actually then pause to recognize how much we then internalize a different relationship to the work we're doing. Some of what we ended up talking about had to do with critical resistance and the early conversations about what would be on the first critical resistance poster, and the idea of avoiding bars and instead having that eye that some of us know very well, that had the kind of horizon colors in it, and just that both the conversation around the image and then the image itself is all doing work that's so important. When we think about building power, we also have to think about the ways that power is being, how we are being worked through, power is working through us through images. And so it's important for us, I think, to build in the movement an awareness of how they're working on us and to counter that. So I'm always wanting to be involved with projects that are working with artists who are trying to do this work. And then also recognizing how difficult it is, because the art world, for example, is so elitist. It's another terrain in which so many people have been excluded, but it is also a place that people have expressed that they have tremendous interest, especially those who've been inside and who've found that art is one really important way to make an important difference in their lives. And of course, some of you may know the work of Nicole Fleetwood, which has been recently published, which is also about this. And there are many, many ways in which I think we have to factor in visuality as a part of our relationship to power.
May I add one brief addition to the wonderful responses? I think that by focusing on genealogies in the book, by insisting on imagining new futures, we also were attempting to encourage people to reflect deeply on questions of time, temporality, and not remain ensconced in the present, in the way capitalism encourages us to see the past as just an extension of the present and the future as an eternal present. I mean, that is the nature of the capitalist market. And to, by encouraging people to think about the long history of abolition, going back to anti-slavery abolition and W.B. Du Bois's analyses of abolition. We recognize that we were also thinking about the long history of abolition and how work that happened in, say, the 1970s that I was a part of, I'm the oldest member of the group, has had an impact on the 21st century. And that, while many of the Attica brothers are most of the Attica brothers are no longer with us, that call for abolition that happened in 1971 resonated not only geographically, spatially, but also temporally. And so this moment of activism that we have experienced in the summer of 2020 reflects a kind of causality that, if you will, that makes us recognize how our work might resonate in the future. And so the temporalities of abolition feminism are not confined to the goals that can be achieved in the next couple of years. Or, sometimes I refer to the questions that foundations always ask when people are applying for grants. What is the 1-year outcome? What is the 3-year outcome? What is the 5-year outcome? But we also want to know, what is the possible 50-year outcome? What is the possible 100-year outcome? And that's very much an anti-capitalist temporality. But it also reflects the kinds of indigenous temporalities that are necessary for us to hold on to a planet that is in the process of being destroyed precisely because of capitalist temporalities.
Absolutely.
We're gonna move now to some of the questions that have come in from the Portal Project attendees, as well as, depending on time, some from YouTube. We've got about 20-ish minutes, so we'll see how many of these we can get through. So the first one comes from one of our Portal Project working group members. Esteban writes, I want to go one level deeper by building on the question I had asked and Erica's response, because so often abolitionist horizons are unhelpfully vague and only manage to name values and principles. When we think about non-reformist reforms of changing the systems that shape our society, what are some of your ideas for the kind of things we should be building that become critical foundations for an abolitionist future? What abolitionist formations and structures do you think we should be building in the short term in service of that vision? I think also speaks to this point that you were raising, Angela, about a different kind of temporality.
Well, if no one is, oh, go ahead. Erica, were you about to unmute?
I was just going to loop back to Gina's point about universities and push for free community colleges that have radical, I mean, political education is so central to the kind of work that we want to do, yet we have so few sites and spaces for that. So why not think about labor unions as having an abolitionist, a feminist abolitionist politic, and build cultures of political education inside of labor unions. And I'll just, give a shout out that we do in the book to the Chicago Teachers Union that I think is working along towards that. I mean, other institutions and structures are, free, radical. There's no such thing as a university. There's multiple kinds of universities and colleges. But thinking about radical free, I mean, our community college systems in the United States are largely, stripped of or have been decimated, right? So I think trying to think about leaning into some of those institutions and structures. I'll just lead us off with those two, but, how can we work with labor unions and push radical, abolitionist feminist labor unions, and how can we create, radical public community colleges that are free, that are offering transformative possibilities. I think that those might be just two kind of easy responses to your wonderful question.
Well, I was going to actually give a couple of examples that are close to the carceral systems, and that is cash bail. No, the abolish cash bail. And we kind of explore that in the book, going from Women's House of Detention in 1971 to Mama's, help me.
Bailout.
Mama's
Bailout. Exactly. I was also thinking that I would mention parole reform. And I think parole reform can be considered a non-reformist reform. The work that RAP, Release Our Aging Prisoners, is doing in New York is absolutely amazing. The fact that David Gilbert was released after 40 years was a major victory. And the fact that there are bills now being proposed that specifically call for the release of elders on parole and the abolition of the kind of parole system that is supposed to be grounded in rehabilitation, right? People who manage to rehabilitate themselves are supposed to receive parole, but then the focus is always on the original offense. So that's, one of the examples of the intractability of the prison system, but at the same time, a demand for a reform that promotes abolition.
One more thing, this isn't quite as concrete, but it really has to do with our dependence on thinking through the law. I mean, even those of us, all of us on this call who are constantly suspicious of law and order, tend often to have to overinvest in legal systems and in formalization of everything. We think of this when we're talking about Title IX stuff and the way the universities have tried to create these elaborate systems to ostensibly, address that violence. On the other hand, it has forced so many of us to be involved with these systems in ways that are deeply damaging to everyone involved. Campaigns like Cops Off Campus and other campaigns are focusing on some of this, but it comes to a different kind of level. So I know the question was really about what we should build, but I think it's also about remembering not to try to formalize everything. A lot of what we are documenting in the book are these provisional, temporary relationships. So it doesn't always have to mean, building up a new kind of society from the ground up where everything is designed to be permanent. And I think that it really does require a whole different way of thinking about law, about formal structures, and really accepting that sometimes delineating more and more rules doesn't help us and is in fact part of how the legal system has us attached to carcerality. So I think it's being in all the spaces where we are. It's one of the things we try and write about in the book in terms of critical resistance is invitation for everyone to enter the abolitionist movement from where they're working. So it's not necessarily always creating an alternative. It certainly can be, but sometimes it's trying to figure out how to move differently in the spaces where we are and to not treat our systems as systems where accretion is always our modality. We just make more and more and more and more rather than trying to strip away and to be relieved of some of that burden.
Can I add, I loved those answers. This is why I loved writing this book with the three of you and learning from so many other people about what we wanted to say. But I want to answer that, but also bring in some of the other questions that I just saw really quickly. One is about survivor justice, and the other was a very specific question about anti-violence work. And I want to answer it by lifting up Survived and Punished and the amazing report that they have recently released about working with criminalized survivors. And I think in some ways that's some of the most hopeful, exciting, hardest abolition feminism work that I see on our horizon. And I really invite people to look at it. And the features that I want to lift up are this is an organization that is attempting, an organization and lots of affiliates. So I'm naming one, but I think there's lots of people doing this work. In Chicago, it's Love and Protect, but lots of people are doing this work. It's work that says survivor justice is different than providing services to people who've experienced gender violence. Like fundamentally, questions of justice and freedom are different than, to Gina's point, more services, more rules, more formal institutional responses. And in order to bring justice, deliver justice, work toward justice, it has to be driven by survivors, and it has to be driven by survivors where they are, in this case, still inside carceral institutions, right? So it's an organization that says we are building campaigns to get people home, free them all, let them out, but we also are making sure when they get out, there's something there that will hold them. And what will hold them are their people surrounded by the next web of people, surrounded by the next web of people. It's really building community based on one person's need to be held. But once you do that, then the next person who the campaign works for and is free, then there's a community there. And I think, to me, it's such a good example of a huge, ambitious goal, free them all. I mean, that's huge. That is done step by step, person by person, community by community, network of expanding people who believe in survivor justice, not just a counseling session, to help someone find an apartment, right? And I think there are examples like that. And that to me is that's like on the ground real work. And it's not just a rhetorical position. It's actually a practice that's not about building an institution, but creating opportunities for freedom. And I think for those people who are asking the questions about what do I do with my domestic violence organization, I think you find ways for them to understand what survivor justice is like, and Survived and Punished can help do that.
Any other responses? So we have a few other questions. We won't have time to get through all of them, but let's see. I think Derica asks a question that goes back to Erica's kind of response with regard to elected officials. And so the question's a little bit long, I might truncate it a bit, but in terms of electoral politics, some see the biggest wins coming from our Black liberation struggle as the election of Black prosecutors and cops and so forth. And we're seeing this in Baltimore and Chicago and New York and DC. But this perpetuates the carceral feminism, especially by calling those actors progressives, because they're marginally better than than earlier counterparts. I need better glasses. So then I guess the question is this: how do you think we should relate to these campaigns? And maybe I'll go to Erica with that one.
Oh, great question. I mean, I remember in the last election, people were using the lens of harm reduction to talk about electoral politics, and I'll invoke that here. But maybe it's the both and framework. I'll return to that. Is that electing people is necessary but never sufficient. I mean, I think the work is to build the movements that can hold them accountable, to build the networks, to build the relationships, because we're going to get people who aren't going to do our work. I think that's the bottom line. And I think we can, invest a lot of energy in getting people elected that share our vision. But if we don't have the scaffolding, the sustainable framework language, in place to hold them accountable, then, it's kind of it's a missed opportunity. So I think the work is that both and work. And I think it's also sort of coalitional work. I mean, I referenced in a previous example, some wonderful local elected officials here in Chicago, and that hasn't been my work, my specific organizing work, but I'm very appreciative of the sort of networks that we've developed that are doing that work, right? If that makes sense. So trying to think about coalitional structures. And one of the things that we were trying to sort of animate in the book project is these sort of kind of webs or networks that maybe aren't as visible, aren't formal, but are ways of sort of grouping or thinking about movements. So yeah, maybe I'll leave it there and see if any of my fab collaborators have a more succinct response.
No, not more succinct. Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Derica, and also thank you for your book, Derica. Absolutely. As important as electoral politics may be, we have just witnessed how mass mobilization can accomplish what electoral politics have been trying to accomplish for decades and decades and decades. So it's important to focus on the election of local candidates and the expansion of progressive people in the House and so forth and so on. But let's not forget that this is not primarily what we're trying to do. When we support electoral politics or get involved, is in order to further a larger goal. And let's remember what that larger goal is. And certainly it is not about electing people from previously marginalized communities who continued to do the same work as the others were doing. That makes no sense. We don't need any more Clarence Thomases, in our local communities. But I want to connect that question to Harsha Walia's question, and thank you so much for your question about imperial feminism and the international dimension of abolition feminism, which we really tried to stress in the book. We really made an effort to refer to campaigns and movements in Brazil, in South Africa, in the UK, because we lack this kind of global vision, especially in the US. And oftentimes the focus on electoral politics consolidates that provincial tendency to be only concerned with what happens inside of this country. We don't have very much more time, but I think we should have paid more attention to the ways in which we try to encourage people to think about the relationships between struggles unfolding here in the US and struggles unfolding in South Africa and in the UK and in Colombia and in Brazil. We have to stop acting as if we exist in a vacuum, that we're the only spot on the planet that is important. I'm sorry, I get very worked up about that. So Harsha, thank you so much for that question.
Could I just add that, yes, we can all get worked up about this question. And sometimes I can't remember what actually made it in the book and what didn't anymore. But we certainly had a lot of conversations about this and some trepidations. One problem, of course, is not being deeply immersed in the movements in other spaces and then trying to document them in some way, because we were trying to include so much, to go so wide at the same time as to try to, have a small book. So I have a friend who sometimes refers to the problem as a flora and fauna approach that, especially in the US, people have to talking about the rest of the world, like one little detail here, one little detail here, it doesn't add up to much. So I think this, we did really talk about the loss of the term imperialism in our approaches, for example, to intersectional feminisms. We really did focus on, what that meant, why it is people have forgotten that history, and how difficult it is to sustain an anti-imperialist critique. We were really concerned about thinking about other forms of carcerality, not only what we know about in terms of jails and prisons, but the other spaces that are harder to see inside of, ICE detention, other kinds of prisons around the world and jails. And all of this requires a lot more attention. I mean, one part of the book really is to say that we need to be working with greater complexity. How do we do that? Not by having individuals who are supposed to know everything, who are experts, but rather to create broader networks where we are more robustly connected to each other and responsive to each other, so that we actually have a movement that can be powerful and can counter so many of the ways in which even those of us who come from internationalist traditions have been incorporated into a kind of US-centric way of even talking about abolition. And so we're so grateful for your book, Harsha, but we're also really chastened, I guess, by the problem of really trying to do this in the face of all of the other things we're fighting. And it really shows when we're confronting what's happening right now with Russia and Ukraine, and how our answers are very insufficient, and that it's very difficult to introduce complexity in our conversations. And so we mostly hoped in some ways that this book was a model of the kinds of collaboration that can invite others to feel a part of things, rather than a set of answers to questions.
So to build off of that, I want to bring in a question from a longtime comrade of mine, Cindy Wisner, because I think it speaks to much of what has been touched on in this conversation about understanding this as a practice and an approach, including the way that we engage in political struggle with one another. So Cindy writes, can you all speak to the politics of critique that is the dominant frame in the movement and that has been shaped by the university versus the politics of construction around emancipatory paradigms? Many folks use abolition politics to critique movements, in particular nonprofits, organizations, and anything that can be seen as hierarchical, including radical women and GNC folks of leadership. I really appreciate your points about nuance, analysis, importance of historical context, but also applying feminist approaches to accountability.
We're all stumped by how to explain what critique is. That term itself is a little bit of the difficulty of answering in a way, because critique should actually be more productive. And criticism, and certainly a negative criticism, is something different. And so, what we call canceling now, all these versions of competition, which are of course about being inserted into racial capitalism and always trying to have an acquisitive form of attention to our projects. This is, we stumble around leadership questions now, especially. So I think it's a hard thing to answer, because some part of me wants to say that we need to learn critique again. That actually some of what we're really trying to do is say that it's not about saying this thing is wrong, but learning to analyze it and being comfortable with with analyzing and not give up on the analysis, and also know how to then move while we're doing it, which was really, again, another part of the both and for the project, was trying to talk about our constant struggle to both be doing things and making a difference in the world we live in, and at the same time being able to stand back and be engaged with thinking about what we could be doing differently.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. I think it's a great question that requires kind of a really long answer and discussion, but I think the things I would lift up, building on what Gina said, have to do with a hope that abolition, and especially abolition feminism, doesn't become some kind of rigid standard upon which we exclude people who are worthy of our attention or our critique or our engagement with them. It's for me, abolition feminism, and what I think we tried to describe in the book, is generous, it's open, it's nuanced, it's not nothing, it's a thing that really demands a certain kind of attention to certain principles around how we're going to do this work, as well as what work we're going to do. But it isn't, I hope, the sort of latest threshold upon which we judge who's worthy and who's not worthy of our engagement. And I think that's why abolition feminism, emphasis on feminisms, and the way that I think Angela talked about it before, is important. It's a message about how we're going to work together, and what kind of relationships we're going to form, and what those are going to be based on, as well as the work that we're going to do. It's only a partial answer, Cindy, to a really, really good question, but it's also a cautionary tale, right?
I love both of those responses, and it's just a little snapshot of why it was just a joy to work on this project with this crew. I'm going to go quickly because I think then maybe Angela gets the last word, which I'm very excited about. But I think we can hold two things as true at the same time. Like, I'm for rigor, I'm for complexity, I'm for productive struggle, but at the same time, I'm also for generativity and flexibility. And I think that we wanted to model in this project, genealogies of feminists who struggled, right? And who maybe use different language, but we're kind of engaging in practice. I think for me, it matters, like, if people are doing the work and trying to, and grappling with those tensions. And I think that can be a really productive tension between this commitment to rigor and complexity and productive struggle, but also at the same time, a leaning away from kind of like rigidity or kind of inflexibility and generativity. And I think that that is sort of, how we tried to model, our collaborative practice, but also the kind of work that we were, trying to amplify in the project. And it's not without messiness, and it's not perfect. So I appreciate your question, Cindy, and I'm thinking about like, how do we, how do we value and center both of those practices at the same time?
Since you offered the floor to me, Erica, I'll say that I absolutely agree with the points that you make, that all of you have made about the relationship between being critical and engaging in critique, and at the same time building, and at the same time recognizing that one can work within a context that also involves a serious criticism. And I'm using the word criticism now very specifically, because like Gina, I don't see critique as negative. I see critique as philosophically as the production of knowledge itself, so that all critique is not negative. But I wanted to end by saying, since Erica offered me the last word, by emphasizing the collaborative work that we did in producing this book. And in many ways, what we were trying to write about was confirmed in the process of producing this book. The possibility of working across difference, the fact that difference does not have to be overcome, it does not have to be the barrier, but that difference can actually be the glue that holds us together, is something that we actually experienced in the course of writing this book. Initially we thought that we were so much alike in our analysis and our politics, and then as we began to write, we realized how totally different we all were. That we were, at first I think I was really despondent about what the final product. How can we achieve a common voice? But we persisted, and in the end, we achieved this voice that is not any one of our voices individually, but that is something new. And it was the most amazing experience I've had in terms of writing in my life. So I want to thank all of you, my collaborators, and I want to urge those of you who are writers and do this kind of intellectual work who are in the audience to really think deeply about the value of collaborative work, because I think that helps us to adopt a very different attitude toward the futures we are trying to imagine and ultimately usher in to the lives of people and other beings on this planet.
Well, thank you. This was wonderful. And I just want to thank all four of you, the co-authors. And I think what you just said, Angela, really resonates for me, and I imagine many of the Portal Project fellows, because it is about collaborating and collaborating amid difference, right? And struggling together. And that is the only way we can both envision and realize these alternative futures that we're striving for. So again, thank you for the book. It's very clear that the coherence is there. Everybody should read it. It should be a handbook. And so with that, I think the last word or the last note I have to offer is from the Portal Project, which is for everyone. I think we're going to play the video once we sign off. But if folks are not able to stay, hopefully you are, you can also visit the Portal Project Digital Hub at sjiportalproject.com. And you can see Taina Asili's video that is also a documentary that has a number of abolitionists engaged in both conversation and song. It's a beautiful piece. So I encourage you to watch that. And with that, I think we're done. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, y'all. This was amazing. And I'll just say real quick before we sign off, just to double plug what Stacey said, if you haven't gotten the book, go get it. If you're like me and your bookshelf just keeps growing because you get more books than you can read, this is one you can read. It's a easy, accessible read, and it's got an appendice full of really valuable resources to learn more about abolition feminism. So thank you so much to the authors for doing the work to put the book together and for making this time to have a conversation with us about it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for all the
Yeah.
fabulous questions.
And thanks the Portal Project.
Yeah.
For all of your work, all of you.